Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 10, looking at the things that are going on right now in terms of hazards and potential apocalypses. So in this module called The Trouble We're In, we're going to look a little bit at pandemics and disease as a catastrophe, but we'll also talk about economic crashes and also some of the political consequences of some of these things as well. And also some of the political uses of the concepts of apocalypse too. And so where we're going to go here is first talk about disease as apocalypse, then we'll talk about economic collapse as a catastrophe, and then we'll talk about the political attraction of apocalypse, particularly in turbulent times like we find ourselves in the summer of 2020. All right, so to start off with, most people are probably aware that there have been major diseases that have killed a lot of people throughout history. Of course, we are in the middle of a pandemic as we speak. And this was actually taken from June 24th, which is when I'm making this video. And you can see that we're nearing 10 million cases of COVID-19. The United States has 2.3 million of those cases, followed by Brazil, Russia, India. And you can see that actually China, where the virus originated, doesn't even really show up on this list. It's down further around the 80,000s because of their efforts to sort of contain it relatively early in the process. And so one of the things is that we should put the COVID-19 outbreak and disease outbreak into kind of historical perspective here. Yes, this is creating a lot of havoc, and yes, it is definitely killing many people and making many people sick. And if we look kind of historically, kind of two main points here. One, let me actually go to this slide, is if you look back through history, you can see that these are these different outbreaks, right? Spanish flu, HIV, AIDS. Of course, some of these are still going into the present. There's COVID-19. And the relative size of the ball here has to do with how many people have been killed by these. But you can also see as you go back through time, they're not that uncommon that we get these every so often, right? The last really major one that we, that began was in the 80s or whatever, HIV AIDS. And then previous to that, we had the Spanish flu in like around 1918. But you can see that these happen with some regularity. And I think that's one of the lessons too, when we talk about different kinds of catastrophes in this class, is that there's a tendency to forget that these things are actually cyclical, that we can expect them to happen again. I think probably most of us got caught somewhat off guard by this pandemic, just because we haven't experienced anything quite like this in some time, particularly something that is, somewhat airborne in terms of its transmission. But it is, of course, not the first thing that we've ever had, and certainly not the worst either. If you look at the numbers of deaths from these different viruses or illnesses. Bubonic plague, the Black Death, being, of course, one of the really major things that killed close to 30 to 50% of Europe's population. Smallpox also has had a huge impact, but you can also see a lot of people died from Spanish flu and others as well. And one of the things that you'll find is that there's a pretty big connection to things moving around in certain ways when you have these particular kinds of pandemics, right? It makes sense. Anything that travels all over the world means that the disease somehow travels all over the world, and usually that's because the people that are infected with it are traveling, right? So it's a case of relocation, diffusion. And so it's interesting how globalization, economics, politics, and health all sort of affect each other. So for instance, if we look at some of these major plagues that have gone on in the histories, a lot of them really spring up when a particular kind of illness or virus, a pathogen, travels and moves into some new population. So for instance, bubonic plague is something that originated in some of the steppe areas of Asia. And then when it moved into Europe, as people came in that direction, it spread into this big, urban population and killed millions of people. Smallpox had been in Europe and other parts of the old world for some time and had killed large numbers of people. But really, it was in the 1500s and 1600s in the Americas and also throughout the Pacific when European settlers arrived and brought smallpox. It totally decimated the populations that hadn't been exposed to it previously. And then, of course, the Spanish flu was one where World War I and all the people moving around associated with that really transmitted the disease. And so when we're looking at this current outbreak, it too is, of course, affected by the way people move around. And you could argue that right now, the world, well, prior to the pandemic, the world was more interconnected in more than it has ever been before, in terms of the numbers of people moving around the planet from one place to another. And so different kinds of diseases have different levels of being infectious, right? There's this term R0 here that basically denotes if you have one sick person, how many people on average are they going to get sick? And it gives you this idea of how fast something will spread through a population. So you can see things like here's COVID-19. It depends a lot on the context, but essentially every one person with it is probably going to spread it to 2.5 people. And then those people are going to spread it. And you can see why this becomes an exponential problem. Whereas if you have a disease that on average is less than one, right, then that disease will basically die out, because for every one person that has it, they don't infect even, they say, if you look at some of these up here like MERS, if it infects less than one person, it's going to kind of die out. It's not very infectious. However, you can look down here at smallpox and measles. For every one person that has measles, you can expect, like 15 people to get sick. And so it's incredibly infectious. And that's one reason why, vaccination programs were so critical in terms of controlling measles, and also where vaccination programs haven't been implemented terribly well or have kind of fallen off, you get resurgences of measles quite quickly. And again, this is all very connected to the fact that we're very interconnected, right? And one of the reasons why the world is more interconnected than ever before has to do with the fact that we have this global division of labor. And this gets into kind of concepts of globalization, but this is important when we try and then figure out what is the impact of the disease on potential economic collapse. And so just a couple terms here that I want to define. I mean, one of them, division of labor, is just the idea that different people do different tasks, right? As it shows here, looks like somebody is a landscaper, somebody is a carpenter. No, carpenter, I'm not sure if this person just hammers things, evidently. This person looks like maybe they're the foreman, and this person welds stuff. But anyway, we all do different jobs. Some people teach, some people are doctors, etc. But there's also what we refer to as the international division of labor, which is the idea that whole parts of the world tend to specialize in certain economic tasks, and then there's trade from one place to another. So cars might be getting manufactured in Korea or Japan. Computer chips being produced in China, soybeans produced in Brazil, etc. People kind of specialize in what they do best and then trade and move everything around. So you have this very interconnected economy. And there's this concept in economics called comparative advantage, which is basically the idea that you should specialize in what you do best and then trade with other countries for what they do best, and it's a better use of your labor, right? It brings down the prices of things overall, and it's more economically efficient. Well, one of the things that we're seeing now, of course, with the coronavirus, is that all of those linkages are breaking down, right? We have travel bans. Also, it means that people who work in factories can't go to work, and you can't produce the things that you might normally be exporting to sell somewhere else, which means then it's hard to import things. And this is probably no more obvious than it is in the food system, where, when the outbreak began, you have grocery stores that have these lacks, that certain products we're used to being able to have are suddenly not there. And also, simultaneously, you have mountains of food that have been produced on farms that can't get that food to where they usually go. Like, for instance, vegetable suppliers that used to supply restaurants. Well, when all the restaurants shut down, all that food basically rotted in the fields because they couldn't repackage it and figure out how to get it into grocery stores and sell it to different kinds of consumers. So as these linkages all kind of break apart, it has had a lot of course, economic impacts. And so that brings us to our next point here, which is, of course, another kind of disaster. We've got currently dealing with the pandemic, and that at the time of this recording is certainly not getting much better in terms of it being really resurgent in many places here in the United States. But this is having a really big impact economically because people are out of work. People then aren't able to afford to buy things, which means people can't produce things to sell to people. And then people that are investing in businesses and industries, of course, get nervous and think that they're not going to get their investment back. So it causes the price of stocks to fall, and you get this kind of this sharp downturn. But one of the key things here is when we think about the economic problems that we are facing now, but could potentially be facing even more so in the coming months, it's important to recognize that we already have a relatively precarious economy, right? The global economy is relatively unstable. And if you go back all the way back to the 1700s, you look at the global economy and it's been a series of booms and busts anyway, without anything like a pandemic sort of coming through and really kind of wrecking it. And so one of the things that I want to talk about here when we think about what economic problems may be coming up in the coming months is to think about it is that a lot of the economic system is engineered around the idea of sort of avoiding crisis or trying to take a crisis that has happened and push the consequences further down the road. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And so one of the things that puts us into sort of a dangerous situation now is that the economy is already in somewhat of a precarious state. And I'll get to that. This was actually back from 2008. And if you have already watched the video on Inside Job about what happened in 2008 with the economic downturn, this was this guy, Jim Cramer. He's on, I think, CNBC, but he's a fairly, conservative guy, and, he's into stock market stuff. And he kind of surprised a bunch of people back when the 2008 downturn happened, because many people, at least in finance and in Wall Street and stuff, didn't really see it coming. And this is Cramer's kind of response, where he brings up this Marxist sort of response, which was very interesting coming from him. It says, this interviewer said, "Do you believe we will look back on the financial innovations of the last several decades with regret?" And Cramer says, they almost brought our country down, talking about the people in the banks and such. The only guy who really called this right was Karl Marx. Marx understood what would happen if you let the market run amok. They brought our nation to its knees, and we're not going to end up being a great power because of what happened. And so this got a lot of people's attention and kind of looked back at some of the old Marxist philosophies, which come from the 1800s. And you have to understand that some of the philosophies of Marx are usually associated with his ideas of communism, right? But most of what his work is actually about trying to understand how capitalism functions. And so one of the things that, like, Marx's kind of famous quotes is he says, "The accumulation of wealth at one pole is at the same time the accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole." And the reason I'm bringing him up right now is just this idea that, according to, kind of when we look at how economies function, if you're seeing a large amount of wealth in one place, you have to think about economies as sort of relationships. It means there's a great amount of poverty somewhere else. Like, so for instance, think about this for a minute as a mental exercise. What if every single person in the world got paid $1 an hour? Okay, so we've got this world where every single person got paid $1 an hour. And then we have another world where everybody got paid $1 million an hour. Is there actually a difference between these two worlds? No, right? Because what makes somebody rich is the ability to buy things from somebody who's getting paid less than you. So for instance, let's say if I get paid $100 an hour, if I work an hour, I have $100. If there's somebody who's only getting paid $1 an hour, that means with 1 hour of my labor, I can buy what it takes them 100 hours to make. So in other words, they can make all sorts of stuff and I can just buy it with just 1 hour of my labor, right? And so that would make me wealthy. So we have to think about wealth and poverty as a relationship, not as an absolute number of how many dollars. It's the difference between the dollars being paid to somebody who produces and somebody who's consuming, okay? And so that's going to come up here again. But again, one of the things that came up in that documentary that's in this module, Inside Job, is that they talk a lot about the fact that there's all these different instruments around debt. Like, in other words, people were buying houses and they were getting a mortgage. And a mortgage is really just a loan for buying a house. And what happened was banks and other organizations were buying these mortgages So essentially what they were doing is they were buying the debt with the idea that then whoever the homeowner was then paying the bank, and they were getting the interest off of those loans. But what ends up happening is it becomes fairly obvious that home value is overinflated, right? It's not as high as people think it is, that there's going to be some kind of downturn in terms of the prices of housing, and all the people holding the debt that are expecting the payments and expecting the market to keep going up and up and are expecting that homeowners can continue to pay them start getting panicky because they don't think that they're going to be able to realize the income that they thought they'd get from that investment of buying that debt. And then essentially nobody wants to be stuck holding the bag. And so one of the things that we have to think about is if we look at 2008 and then think about what may be coming now, a lot of large banks and other investment entities have bought up some debt, not just in the housing market, but also in like commercial properties, things like that, which have been absolutely hammered by the pandemic because so many shops have closed. Then even like the Gap, which owns like Old Navy and stuff, has not been able to pay their rent. And they've told their store, the people who own the commercial properties, we're not paying. Well, then those commercial entities aren't going to have the money coming in. And then the people that have invested in those properties are not going to have the money coming in. And so there's a problem there, right? So one of the things to think about here in terms of the potential for a bigger economic calamity coming in the coming months is that right now we've had a stimulus package, right, where people in the United States back in like April, I believe it was, April or May, got a payment. And that's kind of buoyed the economy a little bit. But if that doesn't happen again, if there are a lot of people out of work and they can't pay rent and they can't pay bills and they can't buy things, then the people that produce things or the people who are expecting rent, their incomes fall. Then they're not able to buy things, which means factories aren't going to make things to sell to those people in as much, in a large enough amount. And that then means that now there's even less employment because if you're a factory and you can't sell things, you start laying people off. But the second you do that, you have less people that can buy these other products. And so there's this feedback loop that kind of happens. And so one of the things that started happening very early in the COVID-19 epidemic was there was a strong push by the US government and others, and it's kind of put here by, this quote from Trump says, we can't let the cure be worse than the problem itself. And what he means is the economic downturn could potentially be even more damaging than the pandemic. Okay. But if you recall back, in the zombie lecture, I think it was module 2, right? There's this idea of biopower, biopolitics, which is that the power of countries and the power of economies come from capturing the productivity of kind of living people that are working. This becomes a problem when people can't go to work because then there's essentially no value to capture. And this has a huge impact on the economy. And so this basically goes to this idea of kind of how capitalism as an economy is relatively unstable, right? Because it goes from the concept that to be able to make something, to produce something, no matter what it is you're selling, whether it's a thing or a service, like say you're a dentist and you sell that service of being a dentist. Well, you can only sell that service if there are people out there that want your service and can afford your service, right? Otherwise, you're not in business. And so if you think about economics from the perspective of demand, what they call effective demand, the ability to actually purchase things, the less money people are making society-wide, the less you can sell. And the less you can sell, the less workers you hire. Going back to the dentist example, maybe then you let some of the people that work there as hygienists or as people in your office staff go because you don't have as many customers. But now you have even fewer people in the society with money to be able to go to the dentist or to buy other things, and it can keep going down. And so I'm not going to get into some of the nitty-gritty on how capitalism works here, but there is an important point, which is that when the economy starts to contract, it can get into a feedback loop and create a crisis. Well, then the question is, how do you get out of this crisis, right? How do you stop it? One of the strategies is public spending or deficit spending. And this comes from, let's see, do I have it here? Yep, here we go. Keynes, who's a British economist back from like the time period of trying to get out of the Great Depression and World War II. And what he basically said was, you increase effective demand. And what that means is you just have the government put money in the pockets of people. Those people will then go buy stuff. That will keep the businesses afloat. It will keep the employees employed, and then those employees can buy stuff. In other words, you kind of kickstart the economy by just spending a bunch of government money. And this is one of the things that we've tried. About $2 trillion in terms of the stimulus deal was to just pump money back into the economy. You have to remember, if you yourself got a stimulus check, or if your family did, it wasn't given to you necessarily because the government cares about you being okay. What they care about is you spending that money so that employers are okay and can keep their businesses moving. They're thinking about it in more of a society level kind of thing. And so Keynesian economics, this idea that the government should spend like that in a time period that's a potential crisis, is this idea that employment is determined by how much demand there is. So to increase employment, you increase demand. The way you do that is you put money in people's pockets. And so there's this idea that free markets without that government intervention will collapse, essentially, or it will take them a very long time to right themselves. Okay. But one of the things about crises, I have this stuff up here, sorry, where it says how the crisis of the 70s and 80s was avoided and delayed. But really, this applies to really any crisis. I meant to modify that on my slide, and I forgot. But there are essentially 5 ways to fix a crisis. Okay. The first one is public spending. But here's the thing. Sometimes, like the deficit spending or the stimulus, but you can only do that so much, because one of the things is if you start just sort of essentially printing money and throwing it out there without anybody producing anything, you can get inflation, which means the prices of things will go higher, your currency will become less valuable. So there are 5 fixes you can try and do in addition to trying to do public spending. One of them is that the government, because they're just handing out all this money, can cut back on spending other things. And so they can stop investing in social programs, in infrastructure, in education, in public works. In other words, because the government's just sort of spending all this money, one place they can save it is they can essentially strip mine the country's future productivity to have liquid cash now. In other words, stop having government helping pay for education or building roads or this sort of stuff. But it's dangerous because you can see what happens if you do that for too long. 30, 40 years down the road, you have people one of the things that this actually kind of started back in the 70s and 80s, when you wake up and today it's 2020, the government's basically been doing this, particularly since the 80s. And now, guess what the price of tuition is versus what it was in the 70s and 80s? It's gone up dramatically. I had a friend I worked with at the University of Hawaii. He went to school at the University of California, Berkeley in the 70s. Do you know how much he paid for tuition? 0. Not because he was special, but because if you were a California resident and you qualified to get into the University of California, the state paid for everything. Tuition was 0. When I went to school in the 90s, I paid $600 a semester and it wasn't just because education hasn't gotten that much more expensive. What's happened is the government has stopped funding it. It used to be that state governments paid a lot of money for higher education, and then that's one of the places they cut back on spending, meaning that now it's up to individuals to take on a whole bunch of debt, right, for education, but also for other things too. So you're hurting your future productivity. You're hurting the ability for people to make money later individually because we then have in debt. There's another thing you can do if your economy is starting to sort of go down into crisis, and which is sometimes referred to as the temporal fix. Essentially what this means is you can try to sell things more quickly. In other words, let's say you're a cereal company and you're Cheerios, right? And you used to sell, a box every 2 weeks to people. You can start having an advertisement campaign being like, don't just eat Cheerios for breakfast, Cheerios for dinner. It's great. And the idea is that you then sell twice as many Cheerios every 2 weeks, right? Because now people need 2 boxes of Cheerios instead of 1. But you can see that there's a limit to this, because when everybody in an economy is trying to do that, it doesn't necessarily work, because you can only still buy as much stuff as you have money for. But it's one of the techniques, at least at an industry level or as a firm level, to try and get out of this kind of crisis. The other thing you can try and do to save money is switching to what they refer to as just-in-time manufacturing. What this means is you don't make anything until there's a demand for it. And so a lot of manufacturing has become what they refer to as just-in-time, meaning you don't warehouse a lot of stuff. Like, for instance, it would be the difference between, say, back in the 1960s, a car manufacturer would be like, let's just make 1,000 cars, put them out there, and then just try and sell them. Just-in-time manufacturing is, let's let somebody get on a website, design exactly what things they want in their car, what color, what different, kinds of special, features they want on it. Then we'll make it and get it out of the production and send it to them quickly, right? One of the advantages of that is you don't make a whole bunch of stuff that then just sits around, right? So it's a way to kind of save money and cut costs. But we've done that. And here's the other thing. When the global supply chains are starting to kind of come apart, as they are now with the pandemic, this is really difficult, because what it means is that whatever products were being made in China 4 or 5 months ago, and that stopped, it's not like we have a bunch of those in the warehouse waiting to sell. We have to wait till they start making them again, right? And so in other words, you feel these shortages very, very quickly in a global economy. But probably the most important way in which you delay or try to get out of crisis is debt. In other words, you give people credit. So for instance, if you've lost your job and you can't buy things, and that's happening to a lot of people, well, you start giving them credit cards, right? Because, and again, you have to remember, this isn't about the person getting the credit card. This is about keeping the economy afloat, because you're giving somebody credit so that they can then buy stuff now, even though they don't have income. And that's the same thing with, say, with like education. If people still want education, but the state isn't going to pay for it anymore and people can't afford it, then you give them student loans, right? Credit. And then the last way to try to get out of this, out of a crisis, is what they call the spatial fix. And this is important. The spatial fix is this idea that if you are, as an economy, suffering because you don't have enough customers, you don't have enough people buying it, then you start going overseas and try to sell things to other people. Or you go overseas to get workers who you can pay less money, so your production costs go down. But essentially, this is what globalization is, sort of in a nutshell. That's one of the other ways you can try and jumpstart an economy if you don't have enough demand. You go find demand somewhere else. And this worked for a long time in the global economy. If you think back to the 1980s, the Soviet Union wasn't really part of the global economy. Eastern Europe wasn't part of the global economy. China wasn't part of the global economy for all intents and purposes. So when those places then opened up, all of a sudden you had all these new customers. You had all these new potential workers that you could pay less, and also people you could sell things to. We are now at an end of that process, right? Because now the global economy has basically gone everywhere. There's no new place on the earth that is new customers that somebody else hasn't already gotten to, right? At least not in any large way. Now that you have manufacturing in sort of the lowest of the low-cost areas like Vietnam, Cambodia, Honduras, etc., there's really nowhere else to go for cheaper labor. So that spatial fix, that idea of kind of finding more ways to be profitable by doing globalization, was coming to an end anyway. But then you've got the pandemic, which totally tears apart a lot of those linkages and severely hurts your ability to make things in another country and move them here, or to sell products to some other country, because some of those linkages are now broken. Okay. Hold on. I got my fixes. Sorry. But one of the things about all of these strategies, and I want to go back to the debt one. The question comes, how much debt can we keep accruing here? Like, we just had this big stimulus package. Can we keep doing this? Can we just keep forking out more and more money every 2 months to keep the economy afloat? At some point, there's probably going to be a consequence of this. And one of the things that to kind of be aware of in the coming months is that the contradictions in the economy, kind of the precariousness of the economy, typically show up as a credit crisis, an inability to keep offering credit or to prop up demand. And part of this is about this idea, I think earlier I said, you don't want to be left holding the bag, right? In other words, if you're one of these investment firms and you're buying up all this debt with the assumption that you're going to get money and interest back from it, when you start feeling like maybe the people out there, there's too much unemployment, the economy's going south, and you're not going to get paid, you try and get rid of what you've got, that debt, right? Because you don't think, but nobody wants to buy it either. And so nobody kind of wants to get left holding this bad debt that's never going to get paid. And this is when you usually see, like in 2008, where you see banks or investment firms fail because all of a sudden they're holding way more in debt than they actually have real assets to kind of cover those things. And it all comes spiraling down, sometimes incredibly quickly. So this is one thing to sort of be watching and wary of. And in the discussion, I have a link to another article that talks about maybe about the potential of more banking problems coming this year. If you're interested in this subject, it's worth looking at because it kind of gets into why this could be the next kind of place where an even bigger recession or depression kind of comes from because of COVID. Yeah. And one of the things to think about in terms of debt is that, when we had the big economic downturn in 2008, one of the ways we got out of it was essentially through debt, by shoveling money to the banks. And also giving more consumer credit to people. But here's the thing. We now have so much debt compared to how much money or how many goods and services we actually produce. It's getting a little bit crazy. So for instance, we have in 2018, there was $237 trillion in debt out there in the world market. However, if you look at the global domestic product or the global gross domestic product of the entire world, for a year, it was about 80 trillion. In other words, the total value of everything we created in the entire world, every country in 2017 was $80 trillion. The amount of debt circulating out there was 237 trillion. In other words, we've got a lot more money out there where people think they're going to get paid at some point than people are actually producing. And this cannot go on forever. Okay. And so because of these vulnerabilities that existed before the pandemic, when you have this disruption in global trade, limiting of people's mobility, limiting of productivity, things have been propped up a little bit with some more deficit spending, but the question is, how long can that go on? Something else that folks have been bringing up is right now, the United States has a little bit of an advantage in that most countries really like to hold on to US dollars as a currency that's considered to be stable. If this drags on here in the United States a lot longer, and particularly if other parts of the world start kind of recovering from the pandemic because they've handled the public health aspects of it better, we may lose the ability of having the dollar be sort of the international currency that everybody uses for trade. If that happens, it will have a very dramatic economic impact on the United States and what we're able to do in terms of debt and deficit financing. And so something to kind of also be aware of out there. And then the other thing to kind of consider is, what is the future of kind of globalization and interconnection of the globe after this pandemic? Clearly, at some point, this will end, and you would think things would be reconnecting, and you'd have more tourism and more kind of global trade. But what sort of lasting effects are we going to see after this is all said and done? Well, this slide, evidently, I just have way too many times. Okay. So in the face of the political, economic, and health crises on a global level, there's a big question mark. How is the world going to respond to this? Are people going to band together or kind of divide up and turn more towards visions of like apocalypse and catastrophe? And this is what I kind of mean by that. After the pandemic is over, are we going to kind of, as a globe and as a human kind of society, global society, are we going to stay more delinked and have more national economies that are more self-sufficient because we fear the risk that comes from being connected in the global economy? Or will we look at this pandemic and think, well, gosh, obviously the world is incredibly interconnected. Every country almost in the world was affected by this pandemic and the economic downturn. Maybe we need to be more cooperative, both in terms of being able to manage public health threats and the global economy. That's another way we could go. But a lot of this comes down to sort of an attitude, which is when we see disease or poverty or environmental hazards or discrimination or oppression, do we see it as their problem or our problem collectively around the world? And I think that's a key point in terms of what's going to come out of this pandemic. Do we come out of it thinking about, like, are we coming out of it blaming China or blaming this group or that place or whatever, or this political party or that one? Or do we actually be like, you know what, we need a concrete plan for how to sort of handle this the next time together? And at the moment, we seem pretty far away from that kind of idea of coming together collectively to deal with this. And this kind of brings me back around to the last point of this module, is that in these kind of crisis moments, both economically and in terms of the health crisis, you start seeing a little bit of an uptick in apocalyptic visions, promising fundamental or violent change. Okay. And this is not new, this idea that when things are tough and when there's a state of crisis, that people start getting more and more into the idea that apocalypse is very imminent. And, I think in one of the readings, they talk a little bit about the Millerites, right? And they're talking about QAnon, which I'll get to here in a second. But, these were folks back in the mid 1800s that thought that the end of the world was coming. And there they were in New York State sitting on the rooftops waiting for it. And then when it didn't come, they called it the Great Disappointment. And this actually became the Seventh-day Adventist Church, kind of came out of this movement of Millerites. But the key point here is that the idea that the end is near and that apocalypse is coming is not a new idea. This has been going on for a long time. And even back around the year 1000, there was also a lot of talk that because it was the millennium, people thought that maybe that was going to be the end of the world, like over 1,000 years ago. Clearly it wasn't. You have the 1800s. Then you also have other less established religions like Heaven's Gate, which was the cult that thought that the end of the world was coming and that they were going to get saved on a spaceship that was hiding behind a comet. So they all committed suicide and put on their Nikes in California. I guess this was close to 20 years ago, right? And so you get these different kind of visions of sort of apocalypse that people start linking onto. But here's what I think is really interesting is that these religious ideas of apocalypse start becoming the political foundations of secular and political movements. And this is where it gets to the reading for this module on QAnon, right? And this idea that sort of the storm is coming or the storm is here, and that there's going to be this sort of epic battle sort of for the soul of the country. And that people kind of take on faith that this sort of apocalyptic battle is coming. And they're obviously associated with sort of a right-wing kind of political philosophy. Also on the political right, you get folks like the Boogaloo movement, right? Boogaloo Boys and others, which have this idea that there's going to be a second civil war, that it's going to be essentially a race war, and they feel like it is their responsibility to bring it about by actions of violence. But it's also an apocalyptic vision, this idea that you're going to have this final battle that's going to create the world as they want it, which with the example of the Boogaloo movement and stuff like that is a very much a right-wing kind of white supremacist view that what happens after the race war is sort of an installation of a direct, what's the right word, an explicitly white supremacist sort of government, right? But the right wing is not the only people that have this idea of apocalyptic visions in their secular philosophies. If you think about folks on the left side of the political spectrum, there has for a long time been this idea of the revolution, right? And the revolution is this cleansing sort of battle that happens where you overthrow the old government, you have a new one, and it's very much an apocalyptic ideology, right? You have this great overturning, this great revealing of what's going on in society. The wicked are punished, the good are raised up, and then everything is goes happily ever after. If, however, you've actually seen or understand the history of what's happened after a lot of leftist revolutions, like the Russian Revolution, it is not happily ever after, right? But there's still that ideology. After the revolution, everything's going to be okay and better, just like that idea of a new Jerusalem will come in. And of course, you also get kind of an apocalyptic narrative as well in environmental movements too, which are usually associated with the political left, right? This idea that climate change or other kinds of impending environmental disasters is an impending apocalypse, and there needs to be a serious change in order to address them, right? And then the last thing I'll mention too is that, sorry, my picture of Xi Jinping behind there with Trump together, is that a lot of these different groups around the world believe in some of these kinds of ideas, but they believe in them in a very nationalist way. In other words, a lot of these groups think that their particular nation is the kind of the chosen people, and that in a kind of an apocalyptic setting, it's all the, quote, others that are going to then suffer. And so when you see the same kind of ideology and belief all over the place with different groups, it's a little bit disconcerting because it's obviously cuts down on the potential of kind of collaboratively solving problems, right? Okay, all right, yeah, my last QAnon thing. Okay, and so the point here is that all these different kind of secular political movements have apocalypse sort of at their core, right? And this apocalypticism functions both as a critique of society, right? This idea that if you don't change behavior or your political life will burn, right? There will be this major consequence. And this goes all the way back, if you think about when we've talked about the book of Revelation, and the idea that the first part of that book is this criticism of what these churches in, what is now today Turkey, right? What these churches were doing. It's kind of critiquing them and saying, if you don't kind of clean up your act, well, you got to clean up your act because otherwise this really bad, kind of judgment is coming. And so you see that in a lot of the apocalyptic visions on both the left and the right today. And then also the other thing you see in these is this hope for a new Jerusalem, right? A cleansing force that brings the new Jerusalem and a better life for everybody after this cataclysmic battle, right? But here's the thing, and this is where we're going to leave it off next module, which, by the way, next module is only like 15 minutes for the video. This one had a lot of information. Apologize for the long length. But this is where we're going to end the class next module, is even though this idea of the apocalypse is very, very popular on all sides of the political spectrum, we should really be asking ourselves, what if the apocalypse is not coming, right? What if there's nobody coming to help, right? What if the problems we're dealing with today are going to be still the same problems we deal with tomorrow, right? If the hazards we see today are still going to be the hazards we see tomorrow, rather than it all sort of being fixed by some other actor, whether that be a political actor, a more powerful human, or a divine kind of intervention. What do we do if that's not coming? So that'll be the last module, but that's it for this one. And I will see you at the next module.